I'm an Omega, and I got pregnant with an Alpha I've been in love with for years. Sounds like a love story, right? It's not, because he doesn't even know it was me that night. To him, I'm just no one. And the worst part? He hates Omegas. Not casually, not indifferently. He avoids them like they don't belong in his world. So yeah, there's no version of this where I walk up to him and tell the truth, and everything magically works out. That's not how this ends. So I made a choice. I keep the baby, and I keep the secret. No drama, no expectations, no second chances. Just me, and something I'll carry to the end, whether he ever knows or not. Daniel Reed was the kind of alpha people admired and feared, the kind of person whose name carried weight long before he ever walked into a room. And there was one thing everyone knew about him without question. He didn't tolerate Omegas, not in his space, not in his life, not even in passing, which was exactly why what happened that night should have never happened at all. Because during a rare moment when even someone like him could lose control, everything slipped just enough for fate to intervene. And I, someone who had spent years existing quietly on the edges of his world, was the one who walked in at the worst possible time. It should have been something I walked away from immediately, something I buried and never looked back on. But reality didn't work that way, because by the time graduation came around, everything had already changed in ways I couldn't undo. My cap and gown hid the slight curve of my stomach, something no one else noticed but me, and all I wanted was a single photo to mark the end of that chapter of my life. Just one moment I could keep for myself. But I didn't even get that, because before I could step away, a hand closed around the back of my neck, firm enough to stop me, but not rough, and a low voice followed, controlled but edged with suspicion, asking, "Where did you get that mark?" The summer heat was heavy, the kind that made the air feel thick. But the breath near my skin felt even warmer, and for a second my entire body locked up. Before I slowly turned, already knowing who I would see, and there he was, Daniel Reed, standing behind me like nothing in the world could shake him, one hand in his pocket, the other lifting the edge of my collar like he had every right to, his gaze dropping to my neck, studying something that had already faded but clearly hadn't disappeared completely. And even though every instinct in me told me to step back, to create distance, I forced myself to stay calm, pressing a hand lightly over my stomach without thinking as I offered a small, controlled smile. "It's nothing," I said, keeping my tone easy. "Just an old bite." Trying to brush it off before he could look any closer, before he could start asking questions I couldn't answer. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" He straightened slowly, his expression unreadable as he looked down at me. "You keeping track of my schedule now?" And just like that I knew I had made a mistake, because I shouldn't have known that, shouldn't have. Remembered something so small, not when I had spent months doing everything I could to stay out of his sight, avoiding the places he frequented, counting down the days until I could leave quietly without drawing attention. And yet here I was, cornered anyway, so I forced myself to recover, my mind racing as I searched for an exit, and when I noticed a group approaching in the distance, I seized the opportunity immediately, gesturing casually in their direction. "I thought you had a lecture," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They were looking for you." His attention shifted just enough for me to breathe, his posture changing slightly like he might actually leave, but then he paused, glancing back at me with something uncertain flickering in his expression, and that was when I made my decision, small, almost unnoticeable. I let a trace of my scent slip through, light and clean. Something soft enough to be dismissed if he wasn't paying attention. But he noticed, of course he did, his reaction immediate as he stepped back slightly, his expression tightening as disbelief crossed his face. "You're not a beta?" he said, and I blinked, keeping my expression neutral, almost innocent. "I never said I was." His gaze darkened, irritation flashing across his features as the group got closer, and without another word he looked away, his voice turning cold and distant. "Then stay away from me," he said. "I don't want to smell you again." And I nodded quickly, lowering my gaze as I covered my neck. "Understood," I said quietly. "I've already graduated, you won't see me again." And for a moment he looked at me like I was something inconvenient, something not worth the effort, before turning and walking away without another word. And I stood there watching him go, my chest tightening with something I couldn't explain, because the truth was simple in a way I didn't want to admit. I liked him, more than I should, more than made sense, and no matter how much I tried to push it down, no matter how much I told myself to let it go, I couldn't seem to stop. "My name is Liam," I had always been seen as a beta, at least by people who didn't know the full story, and even when I first presented, the doctors couldn't give a clear answer, eventually labeling me as an omega on paper, while my body showed almost none of the typical traits, my scent nearly non-existent, my presence easy to ignore, which made it simple to move through life unnoticed, even around someone like Daniel Reed. Until 4 months ago when everything changed, not suddenly but gradually, like something that had been dormant finally waking up, my scent beginning to develop, faint at first and then impossible to ignore, and at the same time, rumors spread across campus about the night Daniel lost control, about a beta who had crossed a line no one else dared to, the tone always sharp, always judgmental, enough to make it clear that if anyone discovered the truth, the consequences wouldn't be small, so I stayed out of sight, spending most of my time in the lab, avoiding the lecture halls where I used to sit in the back just to watch him, and strangely, the more I avoided everything else, the better my work became, stalled experiments finally moving forward, my paper getting accepted by a top journal, until one afternoon when everything shifted again, a senior student paused mid-task and said the air smelled different. Others noticed too, the room growing quiet as they tried to figure out where it was coming from, until someone looked straight at me and asked if it was me. And after a brief pause I admitted it without explaining further, expecting questions or judgment that never came, only mild curiosity, which somehow made things feel even more unreal. So I went to the hospital, and after reviewing my results, the doctor explained simply that some traits can remain inactive until triggered, that what had always been incomplete in me had finally surfaced, and then, after a brief hesitation, she told me something else, something that changed everything I was expecting. And for a moment I just sat there, unable to think, until I made a decision faster than I expected. I would keep the baby, because no matter how complicated things became, I couldn't let go of the one connection I had to someone I had quietly cared about for years, even if he would never know, even if I had to raise this child on my own, and I understood exactly what that meant. That Daniel Reed would never be part of that life, because his distance from Omegas wasn't a rumor. It was something everyone accepted as fact, and I had seen enough to believe it, which made my choice simple. I would stay where I belonged, far enough away that our worlds wouldn't collide again, because even though I had once been allowed to stand near him, to exist quietly at the edge of his world, that place was never truly mine, and now more than ever, I had something more important to protect, something that made distance not just a choice, but a necessity. 4 months earlier, before everything started unraveling, I had been working part-time at a private club Daniel Reed frequented, the kind of place where everything felt polished, quiet, and far removed from people like me. And that night should have been just another shift until I pushed open the wrong door and found him there, leaning against the wall, breathing unevenly, his usual composure completely gone, the air around him heavy with tension even to someone like me who wasn't supposed to sense it. And for a second, every instinct I had told me to turn around and walk away, to pretend I had seen nothing, because whatever was happening had nothing to do with me. But I didn't move, because if I left, someone else would find him, and the thought of that settled something in me. So I stepped forward, steadying him carefully, guiding him out of that space and toward the private lounge upstairs, the one reserved just for him, moving slowly, one step at a time, until I managed to get him inside. And the moment I turned to leave, telling myself I had done enough, his hand caught mine, not forceful, not intentional, just instinctive, like he needed something solid to hold on to. And when he leaned closer, searching for something he couldn't find, his voice came out low and strained as he murmured, almost in relief, "No scent. You're a beta." And I didn't correct him, because I couldn't, because in that moment the distance I had carefully maintained for years felt dangerously thin. And when he added quietly that he just needed help getting through it, that it would be over soon, I knew I should leave. I knew crossing that line would change everything, but I didn't move, not because I didn't understand the consequences, but because part of me had already stepped past them, and what followed wasn't something I tried to define or hold on to, just a blurred stretch of time where nothing was clear except the quiet understanding that this moment would never repeat itself. And when it was over, the weight of it settled in all at once, sharp and undeniable. And the only thought I had was that I needed to go before he woke up, before this became something real. So I moved carefully, quietly, pausing only once to glance back and make sure he was still asleep. And then I left, walking out of the room, out of the building, and trying to leave that night behind me entirely. But a few days later, the rumors started anyway, spreading faster than I expected, about a beta who had crossed a line, about someone who had taken advantage of a moment that should have been protected, and the anger behind those words was enough to make it clear that if anyone connected that story back to me, everything would fall apart. So I did the only thing I could. I stepped back, staying out of the places he frequented, avoiding the routines I once followed, convincing myself that distance would be enough, that time would smooth everything over, that eventually people would stop talking about it. But even then, I knew it wasn't that simple. Because no matter how far I stepped back, something had already shifted between us, something quiet but irreversible, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it stayed, like a thread I couldn't see but couldn't break either. And for the first time, I understood that some moments don't fade, they settle, waiting for the moment they resurface, whether you're ready for them or not. I thought distance would be enough, that if I stepped back far enough everything between us would settle into something distant and harmless. But standing there on campus with the memory of his voice still lingering, I realized it wasn't that simple. So I walked away from the main paths without thinking, letting my feet carry me somewhere quieter until the noise faded and the air felt still again. A small grove tucked behind the older buildings where no one paid attention, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing, trying to steady the part of me that had been thrown off balance, telling myself it was over, that it had to be over, because anything else would only make things worse. But the thought didn't land the way it was supposed to. So instead I reached for my phone, more out of instinct than intention, lifting it slowly and angling it toward myself before lowering it just enough to catch the outline beneath my gown, my hand resting lightly over my stomach as I took a photo, then paused, adjusting slightly and taking another, not because I cared about the image itself but because I needed proof, something real to hold on to, something that said this wasn't just a mistake or a moment I imagined. And as I looked at the screen, something in me softened without permission, a small smile slipping through before I could stop it, because for the first time, everything felt clear. This was mine, not something borrowed or stolen or hidden at the edge of someone else's life, but mine, this choice, this future, something I would protect no matter what it cost, even if it meant staying far away from everything connected to him. And that thought settled deeper than anything else had, grounding me in a way nothing else could, until I swiped through the photos and stopped on one that didn't match the others, slightly blurred, framed a little off, taken a moment later when someone passing by had offered to help, and that was when I saw him, not centered, not meant to be part of the picture, but unmistakable, just behind me, close enough that if I hadn't moved, if he had said my name, the moment would have been completely different. His expression caught in that brief second before it changed into something guarded again, like he had been about to ask something he hadn't decided how to say. And the longer I looked at it, the more it felt like a version of something that was never mine to begin with, like a life that had almost overlapped with mine, but never truly did. And without thinking, I traced the edge of the screen where his figure blurred into the background, my voice quiet as I said his name under my breath, not expecting an answer, not wanting one, because this was as far as I could allow it to go. Any further, and it would stop being something I could walk away from. And after a moment, I locked the screen and lowered my hand, letting the silence return, because no matter how real that image felt, it wasn't something I could keep, not in the way I wanted, and I understood that now more clearly than ever. So this time when I turned to leave, I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back, because distance wasn't just something I needed anymore. It was the only way forward, the only way to protect what I had chosen, even if it meant letting go of something I had never truly had. The decision didn't feel dramatic when I made it. It was quiet, almost ordinary, the kind of choice you make when you're too tired to keep fighting the same thoughts. So instead of overthinking it, I packed my things, finished what I needed to finish, and left the city behind, not with a sense of escape, but with a kind of steady resolve, because staying would only make everything harder. And when I finally stood in front of my parents' house, hand resting briefly on the door before I pushed it open, I realized this was the first time in months I wasn't bracing myself for what came next. My mom was the first to see me, freezing mid-step, like she wasn't sure if I was real, while my dad looked up from the living room, squinting as if trying to piece together why I was suddenly standing there with a suitcase. And for a second none of us spoke, until my mom walked over and poked my shoulder like she needed proof. "Liam, you're not supposed to just show up like this," she said, half confused. half relieved, and my dad added from behind her. You flunk out or something? And despite everything, I almost laughed, shaking my head as I stepped inside, the familiar smell of home, grounding me more than I expected. But the moment didn't last long, because they both noticed it at the same time. The subtle change I couldn't hide anymore. The way my hand lingered unconsciously at my midsection, and my mom's expression shifted first, sharp and searching. What's going on? She asked, and this time I didn't dodge it. I didn't soften it or wrap it in something easier. I just said it, simple and direct. I'm having a baby. And the room went completely still, not loud, not explosive, just quiet in that way that makes every second feel longer than it is. My dad exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood, while my mom stared at me, not angry, not disappointed, just processing. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Are you keeping it? And I nodded without hesitation, because that part had never been a question, and something in her expression softened immediately, like the answer had decided everything for her. She turned without another word and walked into the kitchen, pulling out ingredients with more force than necessary. The sound of cabinets opening and closing filling the silence she didn't want to sit in, while my dad stayed where he was, watching me carefully before asking the question he'd been holding back. You doing this alone? And I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Yeah. And he didn't react right away, just nodded once, slowly, like he didn't like it, but wasn't going to argue. And then my mom's voice cut in from the kitchen, sharper now. No, he's not, she said, appearing in the doorway with a dish towel in hand. If you're bringing that kid into this house, then you're not doing anything alone. And there was no room for debate. In the way she said it, no hesitation, just a decision already made. And my dad let out a quiet breath, glancing between us before giving a small, reluctant nod. Yeah, what she said. And just like that, something shifted, not everything, not the situation itself, but the weight of it, because for the first time, it wasn't sitting entirely on my shoulders, and I hadn't realized how heavy it had been until that moment. I leaned back slightly, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, and my mom pointed toward the table without looking at me. Sit down before you fall over, she muttered, already moving again, and I did, watching the two of them fall into a rhythm that felt familiar and steady, like nothing about me had changed how they saw me, only what they were preparing for. And in the days that followed, life settled into something quieter. I helped where I could, started mapping out what came next, and for once I wasn't running ahead of myself or looking over my shoulder. I was just here, moving forward one step at a time. And even when my thoughts drifted back, when memories tried to pull me into what could have been, they didn't have the same hold anymore, because now there was something real anchoring me, something that didn't depend on anyone else's choices. And I understood then that leaving hadn't been about running away. It had been about choosing where I would stand, and for the first time, that choice felt solid, something I wouldn't second guess, even if the past tried to follow me, because I wasn't walking in circles anymore. I was finally moving in a direction that belonged to me. The idea came to me one morning while I was standing in the kitchen, watching my mom move around like everything had already been decided, like there was no version of the future where I failed. And that was when it clicked. I couldn't just stay here and wait for things to happen. I needed something steady, something that didn't depend on anyone else. So a few days later, I found myself back at my old high school, standing in front of the office with a folder in my hand, hesitating just long enough to feel the weight of the choice before pushing the door open, and the receptionist glanced up, did a double take, then smiled. Didn't expect to see you back here, she said, and I gave a small shrug. Me neither. And somehow that was enough, because once I stepped inside, everything started moving. Interviews, paperwork, quick conversations that felt more like confirmations than questions, and before I had time to second-guess it, I was handed a schedule and a classroom key. Just like that, my life shifted into something structured again, and on my first day, standing in front of a room full of seniors who looked at me like I was either too young or too tired to be taken seriously, I tapped the desk lightly and said, "If you're expecting an easy year, you're in the wrong class." And a few of them laughed, a few rolled their eyes, but at least they were listening. And for the first time in a while, I felt grounded, not because things were easy, but because they were clear. There were lessons to teach, papers to grade, deadlines that didn't care about my past. And that kind of pressure felt normal, manageable. And when the day ended, I didn't go home and spiral. I went home and kept moving, helping where I could, settling into a rhythm that didn't leave room for overthinking. And at night, when everything got quiet, I sat down in front of my old laptop, staring at the worn keys for a moment before I started typing, not because I planned to write anything meaningful, but because the words were already there, waiting, and once they started, they didn't stop. Scenes, conversations, fragments of something I hadn't fully processed turning into a story that felt more honest than anything I had said out loud. And one night my mom passed by, glanced at the screen, and frowned slightly. "You're still working?" she asked, and I shook my head. "Not work," I said, pausing just long enough to realize it was true. "Just writing." And she studied me for a second before nodding, like she understood more than she was saying, and after that, it became routine. Teach during the day, write at night, build something instead of looking back, and without thinking too much about it, I uploaded the story online, gave it a simple title, and closed the page without checking anything else, because this time, I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I wasn't hoping for anything to come back to me. I had already decided to move forward, and somewhere between lesson plans and late-night drafts, I stopped measuring my life by what I had left behind, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the past. I was building something that didn't need it. My phone lit up in the dark, the sudden glow pulling me out of the quiet like something I wasn't ready for, and I almost ignored it, almost turned over and let it pass. But something about the timing made it feel intentional, so I reached for it anyway, expecting nothing, and saw a message from a number I didn't recognize, just one line sitting there like it had been waiting for me. "We need to talk about your story." And I frowned, thumb hovering over the screen, because that could have meant anything. Readers left comments all the time, messages came and went, but this didn't feel like that, so I typed back slowly. "About what?" And the reply came too fast, like they had been watching the screen. "About how much of it is real." And that was enough to make me sit up, the room suddenly feeling smaller, quieter in a way that pressed in, because there weren't many people who could ask that question and mean it. So I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, hoping it would end there, but it didn't. Another message appeared, this time with a name attached, Daniel Reed, and everything in me stalled for half a second, like I had missed a step I didn't know was there, because I had built distance carefully, piece by piece, turned something messy into something manageable, and now it was right back in front of me without warning. I locked my phone, exhaled slowly, then unlocked it again because ignoring him wouldn't change the fact that he had already reached me. "It's just a story," I typed, keeping it flat, controlled. But his response came back sharper than that. "You don't write like that unless you remember it." And I let out a quiet breath, something between frustration and recognition, because of course he would see through it. Of course he wouldn't leave it alone. And for a moment I considered denying everything, keeping the line exactly where I had drawn it. But before I could decide, another message came through. "I'm in your city," and that landed harder than anything else. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. I stared at the screen, reading it again like it might change, like distance still meant something if I waited long enough. But it didn't, and my first instinct was to shut it down, to tell him not to come any closer to the life I had built, to keep everything exactly where it was. But my fingers didn't move, because the truth was I didn't know what I wanted him to do, and that hesitation was enough to keep me from answering. So I set the phone down beside me and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the quiet returned, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt thinner, like something had already shifted underneath it, because I had chosen this distance. I had built something stable, something that didn't depend on him, and still, a single message was enough to reach through all of it, enough to remind me that some things don't stay buried just because you decide they should. And when my phone buzzed again, I didn't pick it up right away. I let it sit there, vibrating against the table, giving myself one last moment where everything still felt contained, before I finally reached for it and saw his last message. "We should meet, Liam." And this time I didn't look away, because I understood what it meant, not just a conversation, not just the past catching up, but a choice I had been avoiding, and whether I answered or not, I knew one thing was already true. Distance only works until someone decides to cross it. I realized I'd been reading the same sentence on the board for nearly a minute without actually seeing it, my hand still holding the marker mid-explanation while the class waited just long enough to notice something was off. So I stopped, capped the marker, and said, "We'll pick this up tomorrow," ignoring the confused looks as I gathered my things faster than usual, Because pretending everything was normal wasn't working anymore. Not after last night. Not after that name had shown up on my phone like it had never left my life at all. And by the time I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed again, sharp and immediate, and this time I didn't hesitate. I pulled it out expecting him. But the name on the screen made me pause, my editor, calling instead of texting, which she almost never did, so I answered, already tense, "Hey." And she skipped any greeting, her voice focused in a way that told me this wasn't casual. "Where are you right now?" And I leaned against the wall, glancing down the empty corridor. "School," I said. And there was a brief silence before she replied, quieter now, "I'm in your city." And the words hit with a familiarity I didn't like, because I had heard them less than a day ago. "We need to meet," she added, and I closed my eyes for half a second, because that was it, the point where ignoring everything stopped being an option. So I gave her a time, a place, somewhere open, somewhere I could walk away from if I needed to. And when the call ended, I stayed where I was for a moment longer, the quiet around me feeling thinner than it had yesterday, like something had already been pulled loose. And by the time I arrived that afternoon, I knew before I even stepped inside that this wasn't just about the book. The place was calm, low noise, the kind of space where conversation stayed contained. And for a second I thought I might still be early, but then I saw him, seated by the window with the same composed posture I remembered, like nothing around him ever really shifted unless he allowed it to. And that was enough to make my steps slow, just slightly, not hesitation, just awareness, because I had already crossed the distance by coming here, and my editor stood when she noticed me, her smile quick but measured. "You made it," she said, and I nodded, taking the seat across from them, choosing the angle that gave me space, that kept everything in front of me where I could see it clearly, and she launched into her explanation right away, something about interest building faster than expected, about potential adaptation, about investors who saw something in the story that could be developed further, her tone professional, controlled, but it all blurred at the edges, because my attention kept pulling back to him, to the fact that he hadn't looked away once since I walked in, and then, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to cut through everything else, he spoke, calm and direct. "You're not going to answer my messages," and my editor stopped mid-sentence, glancing between us with a flicker of confusion. But I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on him, steady even if my pulse wasn't. "I thought I already did," I said, and there was a brief pause before he leaned back slightly, just enough to study me more openly, the faintest hint of something unreadable crossing his expression. "No," he said, not raising his voice, not pushing, just stating it like a fact. "You avoided it." And that landed harder than anything louder would have, because he wasn't wrong. And for a second the space between us felt sharper, more defined, like everything else in the room had stepped back to give this moment room to exist. And I realized then that this meeting had never really been about contracts or adaptations or anything that could be written down and agreed on. It had been about this, about the conversation I had been postponing since the moment his name lit up my screen, and sitting there, with no distance left to hide behind, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Avoiding an answer is still an answer, and this time, he wasn't going to let me leave it there. For a moment, I didn't answer him, not because I didn't have one, but because I knew whatever I said next would change the direction of everything that followed. And that kind of moment doesn't come often, the kind where silence still gives you a choice. But he didn't look away, didn't rush me either, just waited like he already knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it this time. And across from us, my editor shifted slightly, clearly aware she had stepped into something she didn't fully understand. "Maybe we should go over the contract first," she said carefully, trying to bring the conversation back to something neutral, something safe. But neither of us moved, and after a second, I let out a quiet breath and leaned back just enough to create space, not distance, just enough to think clearly. "What exactly do you want me to say?" I asked, keeping my tone even, and he didn't hesitate. "The truth," he said, simple, direct, like anything else would be a waste of time. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so like him, to cut straight through everything I had been trying to hold in place. "You already decided what you think happened," I replied, meeting his gaze. "So why does it matter what I say?" And for the first time since I sat down, something shifted in his expression, not uncertainty, but something closer to frustration held tightly in check. "Because I'm asking you," he said, quieter now, and that landed differently than everything else. because it wasn't an accusation, it was a request, and I hadn't expected that. So for a second, I looked away, not to avoid him, but to steady myself, because this wasn't about denying anything anymore. It was about deciding how much of it I was willing to put into words, and when I looked back, I didn't soften it, didn't dress it up into something easier. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, I said, the sentence simple but heavier than it sounded, and I saw the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way he held still like he was choosing not to react too quickly, but it did. I added before he could respond, because leaving it there would have been a lie, and that was the part one was done with. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel real, not empty, just unfiltered. And then he exhaled slowly, like he had been holding that in longer than I realized. "You left," he said, not accusing, just stating it, and I nodded, because that part didn't need explaining. "Yeah," I said, "I did." And my editor glanced between us again, clearly debating whether to stay or step away, but neither of us acknowledged it, because this had already moved past anything she was here for. I thought that was the right thing to do. I continued, not defensive, just honest, for both of us, and he leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance I had tried to keep, his voice steady, but sharper now. "You decided that on your own, and I didn't deny it, couldn't, someone had to," I said, and for a second, something in the air shifted again, not tension exactly, but something more complicated, like two versions of the same moment finally colliding. And then he looked at me, really looked this time, not like he was analyzing or questioning, but like he was trying to understand something he hadn't allowed himself to before. "And now?" he asked. And that was the question I hadn't prepared for, because it wasn't about the past, it was about what I was willing to do with everything that came after. And for a brief second, I thought about giving him another controlled answer, something safe, something that would keep things contained, but I didn't, because I already knew that wouldn't work, not with him, not anymore. So instead I said the only thing that felt real. "Now I'm not running." And the moment the words left, I knew that was the answer he had been waiting for, not because it fixed anything, but because it meant I wasn't going to pretend this could be pushed aside again. And for the first time since we sat down, the conversation didn't feel like something I was trying to escape. It felt like something I had finally chosen to face. I was already on my feet before I realized it, the chair scraping softly against the floor as I stepped away from the table, not fast enough to be abrupt, but enough to break the moment before it locked in too tightly. "I need a minute," I said, and this time I didn't wait to see if he agreed. I just walked, pushing through the door into the hallway where the air felt cooler, sharper, like it gave me room to think, but not to hide, because I already knew he would follow, and a second later I heard it, the door opening, his steps steady behind me, unhurried, certain, and I let out a breath, stopping near the window before turning, because there was no point pretending I didn't expect him there. "You always do that," he said, voice calm but edged with something more direct now. "Step back right when it matters." And a week ago, I would have pushed back on that, would have found a way to deflect it, but now it just sounded true in a way I couldn't ignore. So instead I met his gaze and said, "I'm still here." And that shifted something immediately, not dramatic, but enough, because staying was the part that mattered. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence holding steady between us until he stepped closer, not crowding me, just closing the space enough to make it clear he wasn't leaving this unfinished. "Then don't stop halfway," he said, and I knew exactly what he meant, because everything up to this point had been easier than what came next. Admitting the past was one thing, but acknowledging what it had changed was something else entirely, and my hand moved before I thought about it, resting briefly over my midsection before dropping again, subtle, instinctive, but not unnoticed, because his eyes followed the motion, narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, like he was putting something together piece by piece. "What aren't you saying?" he asked, quieter now, and that question settled heavier than anything before it, because this was it, the line I hadn't crossed yet, the one I couldn't take back once I did. And for a moment I considered easing into it, softening the edges, but I stopped myself, because I had already decided I wasn't going to run, and half-truths were just another way of doing exactly that. So I held his gaze and said it clearly, without hesitation, "You're already involved." And I saw the shift in his expression, subtle but immediate, the way his posture stilled, attention sharpening into something precise. "In what?" he asked, and this time there was no space left to delay it. No room to redirect, so I answered the only way that made sense, direct and undeniable. In my life, I said, my voice steady even if everything behind it wasn't. More than you think. And the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was realization beginning to form, not complete yet, but close enough that I could see it happening. And for the first time since this started, I didn't try to control what came next. I didn't prepare for his reaction or plan my next step. I just stood there and let the truth settle between us, because this wasn't something I could manage or contain anymore. It was something that had already changed everything, whether we acknowledged it or not. And as he looked at me, really looked this time, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be something either of us could ignore, because some lines, once crossed, don't disappear, they redefine everything that comes after. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and that silence felt heavier than any reaction I could have predicted, because it wasn't confusion or denial. It was calculation, the kind that meant he was putting everything together in real time, and I could see it in the way his gaze sharpened, not on me as a whole, but on the details I hadn't meant to reveal, the hesitation, the way my hand had moved without thinking, the pieces I had tried to keep separate finally lining up in front of him. Say it. Clearly, he said, his voice lower now, steadier, but with an edge that hadn't been there before, and I didn't look away, even though I knew exactly what he was asking, because this was the part where there was no stepping back, no softening, no way to make it easier for either of us. So I held his gaze and answered, "There's a child." And the words settled between us with a weight that didn't need explanation. Because he understood immediately, I saw it in the way his expression stilled, the way everything else seemed to fall away for a second as the meaning locked into place. "Mine?" he asked, not doubtful, not defensive, just precise, and I nodded once, because anything else would have been unnecessary, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time, not empty, but shifting, like something fundamental had just changed direction, and I didn't interrupt it, didn't try to explain or justify anything, because I had already said what mattered, and whatever came next belonged to him just as much as it did to me. And when he finally moved, it wasn't abrupt, it wasn't explosive, he just stepped back half a pace, like he needed the space to process it fully, running a hand through his hair as he exhaled slowly. And for the first time since I had seen him again, he didn't look completely in control, not lost, but recalibrating. "How long?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter, more grounded, and I answered without hesitation, giving him the truth the same way I had given him everything else, and he nodded slightly, absorbing it, not questioning it, not pushing back, just taking it in piece by piece. And then his gaze returned to me, sharper again, but different now, not searching for answers, but settling on something more certain. "You were going to keep this from me," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and I didn't deny it, because there was no point pretending otherwise. "I wasn't planning to tell you," I said honestly. And this time, something in his expression tightened, not anger exactly, but something close to it, restrained, controlled. "You decided that too," he said, and I let out a quiet breath, because he wasn't wrong, but it wasn't that simple. Either. I decided what I could handle. I replied, steady, not defensive, just clear, and for a second, the space between us shifted again, not as sharp as before, but heavier, more grounded, like the conversation had moved past tension into something real, something neither of us could step away from now. And then he looked at me, fully this time, no distance left in the way he held my gaze. "You don't get to decide that alone anymore," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that landed harder than anything louder could have. And for the first time since I had spoken the truth out loud, I felt the full weight of what that meant. Not just the past catching up, not just the distance collapsing, but the fact that this wasn't something I carried by myself anymore, whether I had planned for that or not. And standing there, I realized that everything I had built to keep my life contained had just shifted into something shared, something unpredictable. And for the first time, I didn't know exactly what came next, but I also knew I wasn't facing it alone anymore. He didn't leave. Not after everything. He just stood there, steady and certain, like the decision had already been made, and he was simply waiting for me to catch up. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence no longer tense but heavy in a different way, grounded, real, until he finally said, "Where are you living?" And the question landed simply, without pressure, without hesitation, focused only on what came next instead of what had already happened. And I paused for a second before answering, giving him the address without trying to soften it or hide behind anything, because there was no reason left to pretend, and he nodded once. Like it was exactly what he expected to hear. "I'll come by," he said, not asking for permission, not forcing anything either, just stating it like the next step was obvious. And this time I didn't argue, didn't stall. I just said, "Okay," because I knew that if I stepped back now, I would only be running again, and I was tired of doing that. And once that was settled, the rest of the conversation shifted naturally, moving away from tension into something practical, something manageable, like we were both adjusting to a new rhythm neither of us had planned but were no longer resisting. And when we walked back into the room, my editor looked at us carefully, her expression sharp with curiosity, like she could tell something had changed but didn't have the full picture, and neither of us explained, because there are things that don't translate into words on demand, not in a room like that, not yet. And the meeting wrapped up quickly after, the business side suddenly feeling smaller, less urgent than before, and when it ended, he didn't linger, didn't push for more time. He just gave a small nod and stepped away, like he understood that some things needed space to settle before they could move forward, and I watched him go for a second longer than I meant to, not because I was unsure, but because I could feel the shift settling in, quiet and undeniable. And when I finally turned back, my editor was still staring at me, one eyebrow raised, clearly debating whether to ask. "You want to explain that?" she said, half teasing, half serious, and I let out a small breath, shaking my head. "Not yet," I answered, and she studied me for a moment before sighing and letting it go, as if deciding it wasn't her place to push further. And after that, everything moved quickly, people leaving, the room emptying, until I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the warmth brushing against my skin. Familiar, but somehow different, like something inside me had shifted to match it. And as I stood there for a moment, letting everything settle, I realized that for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't thinking about how to control it or contain it. I wasn't trying to calculate the safest path forward. I was simply standing in it, letting it exist without pushing it away. And that realization felt unfamiliar, but not frightening, because somewhere along the way, what had once been something I carried alone had become something shared, something that no longer depended entirely on me holding everything together. And as I finally started walking, heading back toward the life I had built piece by piece, I understood that it hadn't been broken by his return. It had just made room for something more, something I hadn't planned, but wasn't running from anymore. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to. By the time I got home, my thoughts were still a mess, but the moment I stepped through the door, everything shifted, because reality didn't wait for me to organize my emotions. It was already there, breathing and alive in the small crib by the window, and I sat down beside it, staring at my son as his tiny fingers waved in the air before suddenly wrapping around mine, warm and certain, like he had no doubts about anything in this world. And I let out a quiet breath, leaning down to brush my lips gently against his soft cheek. "Hey, little guy," I murmured, my voice lower than usual, softer. "You look too much like him." And that thought hit me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, because it wasn't just a resemblance. It was proof, something undeniable I had been trying not to look at too closely, and I pulled him into my arms carefully, holding him against my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, grounding me in a way nothing else could. "Your trouble, you know that?" I whispered with a faint smile. "Now I have to figure everything out for real." And just as I was settling into that quiet moment, my mom walked in with a bottle, took one look at me, and narrowed her eyes like she had already decided I was up to something. "Where have you been all day?" she asked, her tone sharp but familiar. "And why do you look like you just won the lottery or lost your mind?" And I hesitated, glancing down at my son before handing him over a little reluctantly, because I knew if I kept holding him, I might not say anything at all. "Nothing like that," I said quickly, but my voice gave me away, and she raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Uh-huh," she replied, settling into the chair as she fed the baby, watching me the entire time like she was waiting for the truth to fall out on its own. And after a few seconds, I moved closer, unable to hold it in any longer, a smile slipping through before I could stop it. "Mom, can you smell anything different?" I asked, half joking, half serious, and she paused. giving me a look that said she was already questioning my sanity. Should I be worried about that question? She shot back, and before I could answer, my dad walked in from the other room, took one glance at me, and snorted, "Whatever it is, I'm not smelling it," he said casually, reaching over to tickle the baby, completely unimpressed. "You smell like you've been out all day, that's it." And I rubbed the back of my neck awkwardly, realizing how ridiculous I must sound. But at the same time, I couldn't help it, because I could still feel it, that faint, lingering sense of him, not overwhelming, not suffocating, just there, steady and grounding. And my mom finally sighed, shaking her head as she adjusted the baby in her arms. "If you like him that much, why don't you just say it to his face?" she said bluntly, like it was the simplest solution in the world. And I froze for a second, the words hitting deeper than I expected, because, on the surface, it really did sound that simple. But it wasn't. Not for me. Not with everything tangled together the way it was. And I looked away, my voice quieter this time. "It's not that easy," I admitted. "He doesn't like people like me." And even as I said it, it felt less certain than it used to, less solid than the version of him I had built in my head over the years. And my mom clicked her tongue, clearly unimpressed with my answer. "And you know that because he told you? Or because you decided it for him?" she asked, her tone sharper now, and I didn't have an answer, because the truth was, I had never really asked. I had just assumed, piecing together fragments, rumors, moments that fit the narrative I was too afraid to challenge, and I leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "I don't know," I admitted, almost to myself, and she softened just slightly at that, though her expression was still firm. "Then maybe you should find out," she said, like it was obvious, like I was the only one making it complicated, and I stayed quiet after that, watching as my son finished his bottle, his eyes already drifting closed, completely at peace in a way I couldn't quite reach yet. And as I stood there, caught between what I had believed for years and what was starting to change, right in front of me, I realized something uncomfortable but undeniable. Maybe I wasn't as clear about him as I thought I was. Maybe I had never been. And if that was true, then everything I had been holding on to, every reason I had used to keep my distance, might not be as solid as I once believed. And that thought stayed with me long after the room went quiet, settling into my chest like a question I could no longer ignore. I'm not a brave person. Never have been. In my head, I can run 1,000 possibilities, push forward, take risks, say everything I'm too afraid to say out loud. But in reality, I move slow, careful, always choosing the safest path. And even after everything that had changed between us, even after my mom's words kept echoing in my head, I still didn't ask him, didn't push, didn't take that final step, and it was frustrating. Because I knew the only thing stopping me was myself, but knowing that didn't make it easier, so like always, I chose the easier escape. I buried myself in work, because work was simple, predictable, something I could control, and standing at the front of the classroom again, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Rows of high school seniors staring back at me, stressed about exams, grades, deadlines, all problems with clear answers, clear effort, clear results, nothing like the chaos in my own life. And for a while, I let myself stay there, focusing on lessons, assignments, anything that kept my mind from drifting too far. But peace never lasts, and it didn't take long before a new problem showed up, sitting right in the third row, a tall alpha student who had clearly decided I was the easiest teacher to test, always slouched, always on his phone, passing it around like whatever was on that screen mattered more than anything I was saying. And at first I watched, gave him chances, hoping it would stop on its own. But it didn't, because every time I stepped closer, the entire row would stiffen, faces flushing, phones disappearing too fast, and I didn't need to see the screen to know it wasn't something appropriate for class, not for seniors who were already distracted enough. So I did what I had to do. I contacted his guardian, expecting something routine, something simple, something I could handle without thinking too much. But the moment he walked into the room, everything shifted, because it was him, Daniel, standing there like he belonged anywhere he went. Even here, his posture relaxed, but his presence impossible to ignore, his face a little tired, shadows under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping well. And for a second, I forgot why I had called him at all. "That's your brother?" I asked before I could stop myself, pointing toward the student, and he shook his head slightly. "Cousin," he corrected, calm, effortless, like this was just another errand in his day. and I blinked, forcing myself back into focus. Right, well, I said, clearing my throat. He's been using his phone during class, and not just that. He's been sharing whatever he's watching with other students. It's becoming a problem. And Daniel exhaled quietly, rubbing his temple like this wasn't new. What? Is it? He asked, glancing at the boy, who immediately shrank in his seat, and I hesitated for half a second before answering. Some kind of online story, I said carefully. Not appropriate for class, and Daniel's gaze sharpened just slightly. Show me, he said, and the boy fumbled, clearly caught, before handing over the phone, and I watched as Daniel scrolled, his expression neutral at first, then shifting, subtle but unmistakable, recognition, disbelief, something else underneath, and my stomach dropped, because I recognized it too. Not just the tone, not just the structure, it was mine, my story, right there in his hands, and heat rushed to my face instantly, wishing I could disappear, wishing I had never written it, or at least never let it reach this point. And after a few seconds, Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost like a restrained laugh. You've got time to read this in class? He said, calm but pointed, and the boy stammered, completely thrown off, and I stood there, caught between embarrassment and something far more complicated, because Daniel lifted his gaze, looking at me for a second longer than necessary, like he was connecting something I hadn't realized was visible. Interesting, he said softly, handing the phone back, and then he turned fully to his cousin, his tone steady, controlled. Focus on class from now on, he said, simple, direct, leaving no room for argument, and the boy nodded immediately, too fast, too eager, and just like that, it was over, at least on the surface. But when Daniel stepped closer to my desk, everything tightened again, the air shifting in a way I couldn't ignore. You didn't tell him, I said under my breath, keeping my voice low, and he tilted his head slightly, a faint hint of amusement in his eyes. Tell him what? He asked, even though we both knew exactly what I meant, and I frowned, lowering my voice further. That I wrote it, I said, and he let out a quiet breath, almost a soft laugh. You think I would? He replied, and there was no mockery in his tone, just something steady, something reassuring. I won't, he added, and I exhaled slowly, relief slipping through despite the lingering embarrassment, and for a second neither of us moved, caught in that strange space between roles we couldn't fully define, until I forced myself back into something safer. You look exhausted, I said before I could stop myself, and he raised an eyebrow slightly. You worried about me? He asked, and I almost tripped over my own words. I'm concerned about a student's guardian. I corrected quickly, too quickly, and he didn't call me out on it, just adjusted his tie and stepped back, like he understood the boundary even if he wasn't entirely stepping away from it. And then his phone rang, and the moment he glanced at the screen, his expression changed, sharper, more focused, and when he looked back at me, his gaze was direct, certain. There's a child, he said, and my entire body froze, and before I could react, before I could find a single excuse, he finished, calm and unwavering. It's yours. And just like that, everything I had been trying to hold together came undone. My mind went blank the second he said it, like everything inside me had been cut clean off, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at him, unable to process anything beyond the sound of his voice. What are you talking about? I asked, but even to my own ears, it didn't sound convincing, and Daniel didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply held out his phone, and when I looked down, my chest tightened instantly, because the footage left no room for denial. Me entering the club, me heading upstairs, me not coming out for 3 days, every frame quiet but undeniable, and my fingers curled slightly as I forced myself to keep looking, because looking away wouldn't erase it. After you graduated, I checked. Everything, he said, calm and precise. You were the only one who went in and didn't come out. And the words settled heavily, leaving no space to hide. You knew exactly where my room was, he added, his gaze steady, not accusing, but not letting me escape either. I told you before, I know it was you. And the silence pressed in, heavy and unavoidable, until I finally let out a breath and straightened, forcing myself not to retreat, because if I stepped back now, I would lose everything, before it even had a chance to exist. So what if it was? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What do you want from me? And this time, something in his expression sharpened, not anger, not hesitation, something resolved. If the child is mine, we get married, he said, clear, direct, like it was the most natural answer in the world, and my brain stalled again, completely unprepared for that. If not, I'll still take responsibility, he continued, without pause. And I stared at him, half disbelieving, half overwhelmed. Are you serious? I asked, a breath of incredulous laughter slipping through. Do you even hear yourself? And he exhaled softly, the corner of his mouth twitching just slightly. Maybe I'm not thinking perfectly, he admitted, but there was nothing uncertain in his eyes, and that only made it harder to dismiss, harder to reject. You hate people like me, I said before I could stop myself. Years of distance and assumption packed into that one sentence. What happens when you realize you can't live with this? And he didn't interrupt, didn't react immediately. He just listened, letting every word land. And when I finished, he spoke, slower this time, his voice lower, grounded. It's not hate, he said, and I frowned slightly, caught off guard. It's fear, he continued, and something in the way he said it made me look at him properly, because this wasn't casual. When I first presented, I lost control once, he said, without elaborating, without dramatizing it, just stating it as fact. After that, I avoided anything that could put me there again, and for a moment, everything I thought I understood about him shifted, the edges softening into something more human, more real. I won't hate you, he said, steady, certain. Not because I have to. Because I don't. And my chest tightened, because there was no room left to call this obligation. When you disappeared those last few months, he added, quieter now, I noticed, and that hit harder than anything else, because I had convinced myself I didn't matter, that I was invisible to him. When I saw those marks, and then you were gone again, it didn't feel random, he continued. So I went back and checked, and he let out a breath, almost like relief, when I realized the person I kept thinking about and the person from that night were the same. I felt lucky, and I just stared at him, completely thrown off, because none of this matched the version of reality I had held on to for so long. You told me to stay away, I said, quieter now, and he paused, his gaze dropping for a brief second. Yeah, he admitted. That was a mistake, and the honesty in that landed deeper than I expected, and suddenly I became aware of everything around us again. The quiet stares from coworkers pretending not to listen, the weight of being watched, and heat rushed to my face instantly. So I grabbed his wrist and pulled him out. I wasn't having this conversation here, and he followed without resistance, glancing around once before looking back at me, something almost amused in his expression. You always pick interesting places for this, he said lightly, and I ignored that completely, because my pulse was still too fast, my thoughts too tangled, and before I could overthink it, I stepped closer, closing the distance just enough to make my point clear. Daniel, I said, steady this time. I like you. And the words hung there, simple, direct, no room to hide. And for a second, he just looked at me, like he had been waiting for that. And then his hand came up, warm and certain at the back of my neck, grounding me, pulling me just slightly closer. I know, he said quietly, and something in his voice made my chest tighten in a completely different way. Not fear, not uncertainty, something warmer, something solid. And before I could retreat into doubt again, I leaned in, closing the space between us, and for a brief moment everything else disappeared. The noise, the past, the uncertainty, all of it fading into something simple and clear. And when I pulled back, my breath uneven but my mind finally steady, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. For the first time, I didn't want to run. I took him home with me, and for the first time since everything had unraveled, nothing felt rushed, nothing felt out of control, just quiet and steady, like we were both choosing to step forward instead of being dragged there. And when we walked through the door, the familiar warmth of home settled around us, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. But the moment his gaze landed on the crib by the window, something in him shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and he stopped for half a second, lifting a hand to his face like he needed to steady himself, like he was bracing for something he had imagined but never actually seen. And I followed his line of sight, my chest tightening slightly as I watched his reaction, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about what we had created, what existed whether we were ready or not. And when he finally lowered his hand, his breathing had evened out, quieter, calmer, like something inside him had settled into place, and I didn't say anything, didn't interrupt that moment, just let it happen, because some things didn't need words. And from the kitchen, my mom appeared, already suspicious before she even took in the full picture, her eyes moving from me to him in a single sweep, sharp and assessing, and I could practically hear the questions forming in her head before she spoke. "So," she said slowly, crossing her arms, "you finally decided to bring someone home." And I opened my mouth, but before I could explain anything, she added, her tone narrowing, "This one looks too put together for you. What did you do?" And I let out a helpless breath. "Mom," I muttered, but she was already stepping closer, studying him like she was trying to figure out where the catch was. And Daniel didn't react the way most people would, didn't get defensive or uncomfortable. He simply met her gaze, calm, respectful. "Ma'am," he said, and there was something about the way he said it, steady and sincere, that made her pause just slightly, enough for the tension to shift, but not disappear. And while that silent exchange played out, something else happened that neither of us expected, because from the crib, a small sound broke the moment, soft but insistent, and we both turned at the same time, and before I could move, Daniel stepped forward first, slow, cautious, like he was approaching something fragile, something important, and when he reached the crib, he hesitated for just a second before leaning down, his expression softening in a way I had never seen before, not guarded, not controlled, just real, and my son looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, tiny hands waving until one of them caught onto the edge of Daniel's sleeve, holding on without hesitation, and something in my chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt, because the resemblance was undeniable, not just in features, but in the way they looked at each other, like something instinctive had already formed between them, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost like a laugh he didn't expect, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since we walked in, and he reached out carefully, lifting the baby with a gentleness that didn't match the sharp, controlled image he usually carried, and my mom, who had been watching all of this with narrowed eyes, stepped closer to me, lowering her voice just enough that only I could hear. "You sure you didn't scam him?" "Somehow," she muttered, suspicion still heavy in her tone, and I shot her a look, half offended, half embarrassed. "Can you not say that right now?" I whispered back, but she just huffed, clearly unconvinced, and behind us, Daniel adjusted his hold slightly, instinctively, like he was figuring it out in real time, and my son settled against him without resistance, small and trusting, and I watched them for a long second, something warm spreading through my chest in a way I couldn't explain, because this wasn't something I had ever dared to picture clearly, not like this, not so real, and Daniel glanced up at me then, his expression steady, but different now, less distant, more grounded. "He's mine," he said quietly, not as a question, not even as a statement that needed confirmation, just something he had already accepted. And I swallowed, my throat tightening as I nodded, because there was nothing left to deny, nothing left to hide, and my mom let out a sharp breath behind me, like she had just realized this wasn't some temporary situation she could argue her way out of, but instead of pushing further, she just shook her head slightly and turned away, muttering something about making more food, giving us space in her own way, and for a moment, the room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it wasn't tense, it was full, steady, like something had finally settled into place, and Daniel looked down at the baby again, adjusting his grip with more confidence now, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, but clear. "We'll figure it out," he said, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the baby, wasn't just talking about logistics or responsibility, he meant everything, the past, the future, all of it, and for once, I didn't question it, didn't try to calculate the outcome or protect myself from what might come next. I just stepped closer, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and looked down at the small life between us. And in that moment, everything felt unexpectedly simple, not easy, not perfect, but clear in a way it had never been before, because whatever came next, I wasn't facing it alone anymore. The second book came out quietly, without the kind of noise or anticipation people usually expect from something meant to continue a story, and maybe that was intentional, because this time I wasn't writing to prove anything. Wasn't writing to fill in gaps or chase an ending I thought I needed. I was just writing what felt real, what had actually happened, and when I uploaded it, I didn't even stay to watch the response. I closed the page, shut the laptop, and went back to the living room where life was already moving on without waiting for reviews or numbers. But the response came anyway, faster than I expected, messages piling up, comments flooding in, people asking where I had been, asking if the ending was real, if it was possible for something that uncertain to turn into something whole, and I scrolled through a few of them later that night. Sitting on the couch, while Daniel leaned back beside me, one arm resting along the back, close enough that I could feel the quiet warmth of his presence without it needing to be announced, and I let out a small breath, half amused, half unsure how to answer questions like that, because the truth wasn't something that could be summarized neatly. It hadn't been clean or simple or dramatic in the way people expected. It had just been time, choices, showing up again and again until something steady took shape. And beside me, Daniel glanced at the screen, his eyes scanning the comments for a moment. Before he gave a quiet huff of amusement, "They're invested," he said, and I snorted lightly. "You think?" I replied, scrolling past another wave of messages that ranged from disbelief to overwhelming support, and before I could stop myself, I showed him one that read like a dramatic demand for a sequel, and he raised an eyebrow slightly. "Are you going to write one?" he asked, and I paused for a second, considering it, not because I felt pressured to, but because for the first time, it didn't feel like something I needed to use to process my life. It was just something I could choose. "Maybe," I said, shrugging slightly, "but not because they want it." And he nodded once, like that answer made sense, like he wouldn't expect anything else from me. And across from us, my editor sat with an expression I could only describe as stunned, her mouth slightly open, eyes moving between the two of us like she still hadn't fully processed how everything had come together. "So this whole time," she muttered, half to herself, "I was just background in your story," and I couldn't help the small laugh that slipped out. "You're the one who kept pushing deadlines," I said lightly, and she pointed at me immediately. "Exactly, I deserve credit for this," she shot back, but even as she said it, her tone softened, the disbelief fading into something closer to acceptance, and after a beat, she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice like she was negotiating something serious. "At least give me a finder's fee," she added, and before I could respond, Daniel reached into his pocket without hesitation, pulled out his phone, and with a few taps transferred an amount that made her freeze mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she stared at the screen. "Wait, you're serious?" she asked, and he shrugged lightly, like it wasn't worth mentioning. "You did your job," he said simply, and she looked between us again, completely at a loss for words this time, and I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head slightly as I added my own contribution later, because somehow, even now, it still felt surreal that something that had started as a story I wrote alone had turned into something shared, something real enough to stand on its own, and over time, the messages slowed, the excitement settled, but what remained wasn't the attention or the numbers. It was the quiet continuation of everything we had built, the daily routines, the small moments, the steady presence of someone who had once felt completely out of reach. And as I leaned back against the couch, my hand naturally finding his, fingers lacing together without thought, I realized that the story people had been so invested in, the one they had followed from beginning to end, had already reached its conclusion, not because it stopped, but because it didn't need anything more to prove what it had become, and whatever came next, whether I chose to write it down or not, wasn't for anyone else to decide. It was just ours. That night, I lay in bed with my son asleep against my chest, his breathing soft and steady, while my mind refused to quiet down. Everything that happened today still felt unreal, from the moment Daniel told me the truth to the moment we chose each other. It all came too fast, too close, like something I wasn't ready to hold on to yet. He sat at the edge of the bed, silent, watching me under the warm yellow light. I turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "What are you looking at?" I asked, trying to sound normal. "You, Liam," he said, simple, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My breath caught. Hearing my name from him felt different now. Heavier. Real. He leaned closer, his fingers brushing lightly over the mark on my neck, his voice low, steady. "Liam, I'm not letting you run anymore." His hand moved behind my neck, not forcing, just holding me there. "From now on, you and the baby, you're with me." My body tensed for a second, not from fear, but from something I didn't know how to name. I didn't look up, afraid I'd break if I did. But he didn't push, didn't rush me. His hand stayed warm and patient, grounding me, slowly. The fear I had been carrying for so long began to loosen, piece by piece. Until I finally understood, I hadn't been running forward all this time. I had just been circling back to him. The child in my arms was proof, and so was this moment. I let out a quiet breath, almost like giving in. Yeah, I know. Daniel leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. Gentle, careful, like a promise he meant to keep. And something in my chest finally gave way. My eyes stung, but I didn't stop it this time. Because for the first time, I wasn't holding everything alone, and maybe I didn't have to anymore.